Let me try that again. I'm Amy Hoffer, Statewide Open Education Program Director with Open Oregon Educational Resources. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar, Critical Perspectives on Artificial Intelligence. This webinar is being recorded and it'll be shared later. And it's hosted by Open Oregon Educational Resources, which promotes textbook affordability for community college and university students and facilitates widespread adoption of open, low-cost, high-quality materials. You can visit the openoregon.org website for more information showcasing what's happening across the state. And I'll read you also our equity statement in progress. Open Oregon Educational Resources recognizes that our mission, vision, and values are not meaningful unless we account for past and present inequities. The systemic racism that led to Oregon being founded on stolen land as an all-white state has caused generations of harm. This privileges the lives of white people and shapes the experience of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color that live and learn here today. As a statewide program, we must attend to the impact that our choices have on Oregon's students. Our team provides tools and resources to make diversity, equity, and inclusion primary considerations when faculty engage with open course materials. We also continue to ask questions and learn together. We welcome being held accountable to the ideals in this statement via our contact page. And also on our contact page, you can sign up to join our Google group, and I send a weekly newsletter to that group. It's also a place to connect with your colleagues and ask questions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful panelists, which thank you all so much for joining us today and sharing your perspectives on artificial intelligence. And I will also confess that I'm feeling flustered by my computer being grumpy. And so I'm going to let our panelists determine their order of speaking and introduce themselves as they begin speaking.
Yeah. So maybe let's do it with the order we were going to talk anyway. Thank you so much, Amy, for hanging in there. You're a hero. So I'm Maha Bali. I'm a professor of practice at the American University in Cairo in Egypt, and I work at the Center for Learning and Teaching. Um, shall we do all the intros or just dive into each of our reasons for why we have issues with AI and OER?
Why don't you dive in?
All right, let's do that. Okay, and we'd love to hear from all of you, by the way, and how you feel about it. And feel free to use the chat at any time to comment on what we're saying, to share resources. We're also going to share some of the resources we gathered together. So one of my biggest peeves about AI, and this also is why I don't think it's great for creating OERs, is the cultural bias in AI. And I know that the entire internet is biased. I know that all humans are biased, but humans can be held accountable for their bias, and you can't hold AI accountable for its bias. And one of the things that happens to me as someone with my identity is that I come across AI hallucinations and biases on a daily basis. And I think when I'm in conversations with people who don't tend to think that this is a huge problem, I keep thinking, oh, well, maybe because you live in North America, maybe because you're white or something, you're not coming across these biases as often as I am. I'm coming across biases about my religion. I'm coming across biases against my culture. I'm coming across hallucinations about my history, where a lot of these AI tools don't know the difference between different epochs and eras of Islamic history, for example. And then, so I don't really know how someone can then use that kind of tool to create OERs. And even if it's one of those things where you use something like Google Notebook LM, or one of those tools where you give it the material and it's supposed to extract and paraphrase from it, even those ones miss out on a lot of nuances. And for some reason, some of us have started to notice that it tends to miss out on nuances related to social justice, which is very odd. I'm not really sure, like several people have noticed it. I haven't researched it extensively. But so the epistemic bias that AI already reproduces, I think would happen again with AI. And I've seen people say, oh, well, I'm going to use AI to help me see different perspectives. Actually, no, because the AI isn't trained on that many perspectives. So I think you better ask a human being if you want your OER to incorporate more perspectives. So that's where I stand on that. And I'll put a link to a recent blog post I wrote about this. Heather is next. And I think, Heather, you can add some of the new stuff before you move on to the the other stuff, if you like.
The new stuff, like the thing I put in the
Yeah,
chat.
the
Okay.
really, yeah.
Yeah. And so, I'm actually gonna re-put the link in the chat. So
Okay.
I just came across this yesterday. I'm Heather Ross. I'm an educational development specialist at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, Canada. Um, and before I touch base on that, I just want to acknowledge that I live and the university is located on what's called Treaty 6 territory here in Canada, and it's the historical homeland of many First Nations people, as well as the traditional homeland of the Métis people. And I I I come with respect for the land that I'm on, as well as the people who have resided here and continue to reside here. And on that note, so this resource that I shared is an article about how somebody used AI to write in a book about the Anishinaabe, and then was selling it on Amazon. And they wrote the book with AI. It's goes against so many um, of the of so many indigenous principles to do this. And so touching on the cultural issues around it, this is just one horrifying example of that. But I'm here to talk about the environmental impact, which builds on kind of the indigenous um, discussion. But to to run the server farms that you can use that are necessary for running AI. It takes a lot of land, and in many places in the US, it's using what could be farmland, or has historically been farmland. It uses a lot of energy and it uses a lot of clean drinking water to cool the servers. And it has to be clean drinking water because somebody asked me yesterday about using, why don't they build these near the ocean and just use that because the salt in it can cause corrosion. And so there is the technology for using something other than the drinking water we need, but it's easier and cheaper to use drinking water. So the Washington Post had a calculation, and they posted a few weeks ago that it takes for writing 100-word email, just 100-word email. And I used their calculation and I expanded that to look at 10,000 words. And if you were creating a 10,000-word draft of an open resource, and that would be really, really short for a book, because like I looked it up, Catcher in the Rye is 75,000 words. And so 10,000 words is really short. It's less than 50 typed pages. To get something from GenAI that's 10,000 words long, it takes the same amount of power as running 11,670 LED lights for 24 hours. But the more shocking number for me was that it takes 5,200 liters of clean drinking water for 10,000 words. And that's the equivalent of 7 people drinking 2 liters of water every day for 1 year. So to give you kind of put this in a little bit of more concrete for you, I looked it up, and the Anthology of Early American Literature, which is the open pedagogy project that Robin DeRosa did several years ago, and I checked, and the first 6 chapters come to more than 16,000 words. There's 80 chapters in the book. So I can only imagine the amount of energy and water that it takes to take that open book and translate it, have AI translate it for you into, say, Spanish or French. And this is something I'm hearing a lot of is, well, we can use AI to make translations. It'll be a lot easier than people doing it. But people still need to go back and check the accuracy of this. And this is not counting images, which take far more than text. I saw a talk from Kate Crawford recently, or sorry, this was an article from Kate Crawford recently, and she was talking about how Sam Altman, who is the chief executive officer of OpenAI, back in January of this year, talked about that AI is going to use way more energy than they even thought, and that something has to change for them to have access to that. And one of those things is that Microsoft has cut a deal to reopen the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in New Jersey. They're going to be the sole customer. But the current owner of the plant wants taxpayers to pay for the reopening, for Microsoft to have this so that they can run AI. Now, on a talk that Marissa Birkeland gave, she's a science and data librarian from George Mason University, and I recently watched a recording of her talk, and she was talking about the environmental impact of Gen AI. And she lives, and George Mason is in Northern Virginia, which has the greatest concentration of server farms than anywhere else in the US. And they're using, one thing that they're doing is they're using land that was for farmland. So that's one issue. But another issue is the amount of water that takes to cool those. And she was saying that just the morning that she was giving that talk, they announced on the news, and this was in the summer, that they were asking the people of Northern Virginia, because of the heat they'd had that summer and the low levels of water in the river, to please conserve water. But meanwhile, they have the greatest concentration of server farms using drinking water to cool them. So I've also heard a lot of arguments that, okay, but using AI means that it's going to be quicker, so we're going to spend less time working, less time on our laptops, less time using energy for the buildings that we work in. But there's three problems with that argument. First, most of the work that we do on our computers takes far less energy to do than Gen AI uses, or water. Content created by Gen AI, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, but it still needs to be reviewed and fleshed out and corrected, and all that has to be done by somebody working on their computer. And finally, and I think that most of us can identify with this, rarely does increased productivity mean that we're working less. It just means that we're doing more. So we're going to do more, we're going to use a lot more energy doing it, and causing a lot of environmental damage, not to mention the issues that Maha has already as mentioned and others are going to bring up. And I think my final point, and then I'm going to let the next person move on, is that we hear a lot about the potential for AI, that it's going to do this, it's going to do that, it's going to help cure diseases, it's going to solve the climate crisis, all of this. But we keep hearing about the potential of it. And the environmental damage is already happening. It's not a potential for environmental damage, it's happening now. And I think that's something that we really need to pay attention to. Thank you.
I don't remember who was supposed to go next. Stephen, do you want to go next or should I?
I can, but I think you're next on the list, so you go
All
ahead.
right, sounds good. I couldn't find the list and my memory is terrible. So hello, everybody. My name is Stewart Baker. I use he, him pronouns most of the time. They, them, any other pronoun is absolutely fine. I'm the Systems and Institutional Repository Librarian at Western Oregon University. And for me, well, not to downplay the really big issues that Maha and Heather have just talked about. As a librarian, I see generative AI in particular, which is where um, the artificial intelligence tool creates new content, as opposed to other types of AI, which like predict what might happen or which are used to find patterns in things, to be especially a big problem because I feel that it really erodes students' critical thinking skills, or even anyone's critical thinking skills. There's a lack of understanding about what exactly these tools are doing and how they do it, so that, for example, people might think they're actually researching it, right? We talk about hallucinations, but really to an AI, generative AI tool, there's no difference between accurate and inaccurate information. As far as the tool is concerned, if you ask it to give you a bibliography, it's going to spit out some text that looks like a bibliography, and it did a good job. There's no difference if the information in it is true or not, because really what it does is it looks at patterns of text in its data set, and then it creates something that copies those patterns, based on, in the case of ChatGPT, like a data dump of a large chunk of the internet. So it really just performs statistical analysis, right? And says, well, when this word happens, these words usually follow it, or something like that. And I think there's a big misunderstanding because the companies that run these things want them to be used a lot and earn money off them. That what AI, quote end quote, is actually doing is the equivalent of original thinking or original research, and it's really not. So that's where I come from in this is, in addition to being concerned about the pervasive bias in AI and its huge ecological impacts, I'm really concerned to see it being adopted into open education where the intent is really the opposite of pretty much everything generative AI does, in my obviously unbiased and neutral opinion. You can go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I am Stephen Krueger, pronouns AM, think they, them without the TH. I am the Affordable Course Content Librarian at the University of Kentucky. So I'm going to come to this from a completely different angle in that, like, I know very little about, I have not been keeping up on what the current generative AI tools are or what they do. I just don't use them generally in my own work. So I'm not coming to this with expertise from that side. What I will talk about is what I do as the manager of an OER grant program to talk to authors who we have funded, who were putting University of Kentucky Libraries as the publisher on their materials. So I get questions from people about whether they can use generative AI to create the chapters that we have funded, to create the works that they're developing as OER projects. So this comes up in a couple of different ways. It comes up as questions about whether you can use, say, ChatGPT to generate actual portions of the text itself. There's also questions about, like, can I use this tool, often tools I've never heard of, to generate data representation? So there's a lot of nuances to it, and the policy I'm going to talk about is my way of sort of making those nuances not really my problem, and passing a lot of this on to the authors for a bunch of different reasons. And I will say that when the question in conversation, when people do come to me and ask these questions, like, I'll often refer to them to, like, our data librarian is great for actual answers around the tools that people can use. And so, like, I don't completely blow off the questions, but I want to talk about why I approach the policy that I am developing in the way that I do. So it's got three components. So this will apply to grant projects, but also any OER that we are publishing, that we are putting ourselves as the publisher for, and that's important for reasons I'll get to in a little bit. But I'm keeping it pretty simple. The components are transparency, and that I am saying, like everything else with the grant projects, it's up to the authors to account for the quality and the relevance of the work. I am not a subject expert in any of their fields. I am not looking at the content itself. And in some ways, whether they use generative AI to produce some of the content doesn't change that. I am not reviewing the material. I can talk to them about how to set up peer review processes, but that's not unique to this situation. But what I can ask them to do is, if they are going to use, say, ChatGPT to produce some of their content, I don't feel like I'm in a position to tell them no, because what I'm telling them about everything else is write in the way that you write in your field. So what I can say, though, is if you used something to write a portion of this book, you have to note that in your text. So all I'm asking people to do is be very clear about what tools they used, what they did with it, which portions of the materials are affected. An optional thing that I am also including is that they could note where the tools got the material that they generate content from. I say this with the knowledge that most of the tools won't tell them that. And this is more to make people think about the fact that, like, if you don't have an answer to this question, should you be using this tool in the way that you are? And if more tools do want to be transparent about that, great, they can just do that. Let's see, the other two elements are copyright, and this comes from, this is I think most of us who are thinking about AI and copyright at this point know that like the law is not really set, but what is set, as far as I know right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, is that materials that are solely generated by AI are not eligible for copyright. There has to be some degree of human authorship. Where that line is tends to be extremely fuzzy. And I will deal with that question when I get to it, if I have to get to it. But what I do want to make very clear to potential authors is if you say write a chapter of your text using ChatGPT and you want to include it in, like, you've followed the transparency requirement, you've been clear about it, you also can't put a Creative Commons license on that. You don't own that, it's public domain. So one of the reasons for the transparency and the being specific about which sections you used is that defines whether you have enough ownership to even put a license on it. And let's see, I'm not going to get into great detail in this policy about like where a line for human authorship might fall if you then revise the content. I think that's got to be a case-by-case basis. And then the third component of this policy is about licensing. So there's two sides on this, and this is separate from copyright, though there's overlap. One is that I am telling people that they are responsible for making sure that if they are using a tool to, say, represent some data, they need to do the work of looking at that tool and figuring out whether they're allowed to use the materials in the way that they want to do. That's going to be a license issue, often more than a copyright issue. The other thing that only has just come up recently, I was talking to a colleague yesterday who pointed out that our institution has a list of software, including AI tools, that you are not allowed to use. I don't know the details on that, but it's another thing that I'm folding into this as like there may be restrictions that, and this is where it comes in, because we put published by University of Kentucky libraries on these, that's where I need to be aware of the institutional policies around what tools you can and cannot use. Let's see, I considered some other elements of that. I considered requiring them to put in some transparency about the environmental impact. I would be interested in discussing that with whether people have thoughts about whether one can do that. Right now, I'm feeling like we don't do that for other tools, which also have lesser but also environmental impacts, so it wouldn't make sense to do it for this. My main recommendation from this, especially from that last bit, is talk to your colleagues. I did not know that we had a campus-wide thing that restricted what tools people could use as part of their work, but that is super relevant to this conversation. So I think that's where I'll wrap it up around. But yeah, it's an interesting thing that I'm finding as how do I talk to people who want to use these tools as part of work that we are functionally the publisher for? Another bonus issue that future Stephen will deal with is I do probably need to create a takedown policy for our OER, and in some cases like a violation of some of those licenses, or I need to figure out how AI tools and using them appropriately would fall under that takedown policy and decide whether to put those in there in detail. I think that's enough for me for now.
Someone's asking you in the chat if there's a link to the policy. Is it published already?
It is not, but I will put my draft text in the chat with the understanding this is not fully up, but it's roughly what I've talked about.
Thanks, Stephen. The spirit of openness. I love it. And thank you so much to our panelists for opening these issues for us. We've got a really active chat, and we also have a hand raised. So I'm going to scroll back to a comment that Kevin left in the chat that I thought started a pretty interesting conversation, with a note also that Kevin's in a coffee shop. We have amazing coffee in Oregon. And so he won't be turning on his mic. So I'm going to read what he said in response to the initial issues that Maha raised. And Kevin said it underscores the need for keeping the human in the loop to filter out bias and hallucinations. And Kevin is, raising the idea that generative AI, it's more about how you use it and how much there's human involvement to temper some of the issues. And Maha replied, I think it's a lot more than that, which I love that response, because the idea of keeping a human in the loop, it does make me wonder, like, well, do we need to question the loop itself? what is the loop here? And Kevin replied to Maha, how so? When I create something myself, how is that different than when I collaborate with AI? At the end of the day, it's in my integrity in what is produced. So let's start there. And if the panelists want to respond to that initial sort of discussion opener, I think it would be great
Yeah,
too.
yeah. I think when I hear it, first of all, yes, the expression human in the loop makes it sound like, well, 99% of the stuff is going to be done by AI and the human is marginal. It's like a 1% type of thing that somewhere along the way gets to do something. First of all, again, I do think that some people think the bias is a lot more than it actually is. If you are not a native speaker of English and your language is not very well, Arabic, the internet is full of Arabic, by the way, which is my native language, and AI messes up on Arabic all the time. So if I try to create an AI generated book of Egyptian or Arabic idioms, 90% of them would be incorrect. So the human in the loop kind of situation doesn't solve that problem. The other problem is that humans are also biased, and AI has a lot of implicit bias. Like it won't say directly a lot of its biases, but it's very implicit. So you need to be so woke, so woke to notice every single mistake it's going to make. And if you're doing it about a culture that's not your own, you're not even going to notice those kinds of things because you won't notice those nuances. So it's a lot bigger than a human in the loop type of a situation that you're going to solve. And I'm seeing so many people try to make AI do things about cultures they're not familiar with. It's kind of like in the same way, let's go back to translation that has existed for a long time with AI. And you could never use AI generated translation unless you understood both languages very well. Otherwise, you have no idea what's just happening there. And so with culture, it's similar to that, but just cultures that are not well represented in the training data of AI, it goes so far outside and hallucinates. And at some point, it spoke to me in Spanish instead of Arabic because it couldn't figure out how to answer my question. So it's that level of hallucination that I keep coming across like on a regular basis. I also wrote about, I put an article in the chat about the accountability and transparency issues here. So like with culture and not even cultural data, but there's things about how can you anticipate accountability issues when you're using AI before you even start using it. But a lot of these things are like, why are you even giving it to AI in the first place? Why are you, all the damage to the environment that Heather just described is huge. When we can do these things with much simpler technologies, and there are human beings who have this knowledge, why are we going that far off? Even, I mean, the person, I'm sorry, but the person's talking about the Rubik's Cube. That's not a big problem in the world that needs to be solved, but I know there are a lot of humans who have solved this problem before. The only reason AI knows how to solve it is because humans have solved it before. I am sure there's a lot of content on the internet that tells you how to solve it. I am sure the AI has not figured out on its own how to solve it. Just find the original material of the person who solved it and you'll find it there. And the thing with transparency, and I get where Stephen's coming from with transparency, but the thing is, AI is a black box in terms of the sources. In open education, attribution is so important. And I mean, the issue of copyright and what license you can put on it is secondary to me. The issue I have is I don't even know the answer I'm getting, how the AI came up with it. Like those AI generated books. This is based on other human beings' work that is on the internet that never properly gave permission for their work to be used in this way. Even if you put something public domain, when you put it public domain 10 years ago, you didn't realize that that's what people were going to do with it. And sometimes a lot of it is just like general knowledge, like anybody could have answered that. Sometimes it's not. So I used to ask AI about white supremacy culture, for example, and it would answer me, and I'd say like apply white supremacy culture to this and that. In the beginning, it wouldn't. Early phases of ChatGPT wouldn't tell me who the author was, and now it will tell me who the author is. But the issue isn't just knowing who the author is. The issue is it wouldn't tell me unless I asked it. And sometimes it will attribute things to a completely different author. I have been in presentation where someone has quoted me for saying something that I have never ever said. Now, there are other AI tools for literature review that I think are not completely generative AI, and they do bring in real sources and they sum them up. Those are different, but most people aren't using those. Most people are just using ChatGPT. I'm sure there are other kinds of AI that you can train yourself and feed it the data that you want to do things with it. But if it's got that generative AI component, is it worth the damage to the environment then to use that? And the amount of time you'd have to do to revise this is not small. There's actually research papers that also tell you that the amount of, if it's a very complex task, it's actually just a waste of time to do AI and then revise over the AI. And is that the kind of work we need to do instead of just doing the intellectual work ourselves?
I'm curious if the other panelists want to weigh in. I think I might have just stepped over.
No worries.
Talk.
Yeah, I everything Maha says is great, as always, of course. From the perspective of someone who, I'm super white, look at me, right? And certainly male appearing, right? And I live in Oregon, which, as we've already mentioned, is founded on white supremacy, uh, almost explicitly, as well as with the usual implicit US bias. For that, I think I'm gonna speak specifically here. Like, if you're the sort of person who uses AI tools, if you know about, if you even know the acronym LLM, what it stands for and what it means, you are absolutely way more informed about this than like 99.99% of people in the world. So even if the things we're raising are not news to you and don't really apply to how you think you're using the tool, I guarantee you they apply to millions of other people who are approaching so-called AI as if it is this intelligent being telling them the right answer to things. So if you personally know that an LLM requires a ton of training, that you have to really doubt everything it tells you until you've, run it through all these tests, and that you are really super aware of what it's doing and how it's working and where it's getting its data from and how you're going to mitigate any problems with its data and problems with its output, you're really not the person we're trying to warn, because you should already know everything about how these LLMs work. And that's fine. Like, if you've known all this and you've made that choice, like, personally, I would suggest like trying to be less defensive about when people do point out problems with it. I think we as in white people, to be super clear, when we hear people criticizing tools that we use, we sometimes hear that as criticisms of us. And that's not really the case most of the time. So if you're feeling defensive because you use AI and you're listening to this webinar, I would encourage you to just take a step back. It's not about you personally. Nobody is telling you you personally have made terrible decisions and are a terrible person. We're just trying to share some of the more critical perspectives so that other people out there can make informed decisions. Because what I see when looking at people who use AI is that almost all the time they are not informed decisions, and they are barely even decisions. They're just taking what these usually huge profit-driven companies tell them in their marketing materials and taking it at face value. So that's, I think, all I'm going to say right now. Did I kill the webinar?
Not at
No,
all.
you calmed it down. You calmed it down, which I think is beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. And we now have a second hand, but there was another point that Judith raised in the chat earlier, so I'm going to try to take these in order as they come. So regarding the environmental costs of using AI, Judith raised another perspective. Not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, a really great idiom. Some scientists argue that AI itself will help us solve its own energy sustainability problems, and Heather and Maha both weighed in on that one. So, um, does either of you want to turn on your mic and talk about this, or other panelists? Yeah, please, Heather.
Sure. And I mentioned this a little bit in when I was talking before. We hear a lot about potential, that it will eventually do this. If we give it time, it'll do this. But the damage is being caused now. And a lot of it is going to be irreversible. And how long do we wait? How much leeway do we give companies to cause this damage before we say enough is enough? Because right now they're getting free rein to cause a lot of damage. And we don't know. We honestly don't know that it will ever solve those problems, let alone when they might do it.
The response that I was giving based on something I heard someone talk about recently is that the problem with climate change isn't that we don't know how to work with it, it's that we don't have the political will to work with it. So let's not like turn things over to machines that we actually know how to solve. Or you know.
So
I
please.
was just going to say, as I noted earlier about the issue of using clean drinking water, the technology exists to use something other than clean drinking water, but the cost and the time it takes to do that is not attractive to the companies. So they're using clean drinking water. So we know how to do things better, but as Maha said, the will is not there.
So Candace, it looked like you wanted to turn on your mic and speak. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. I am actually new to the Pacific Northwest. I do work for Pearson now. Nobody hate me. But I worked for another company in the South for 7 years, and we didn't really have AI as a problem in the South. It wasn't healthcare. I think so many people brought up so many great points. So like Heather with the thank you, Veronica, but Heather with the point of the environmental impact. I think publishers and other companies, of course, alike, need to be cognizant of that. That's a really good point. That's actually something I did not know, so that I learned something new today. So daily goal accomplished. I do think there is a difference between using AI as a study tool and like a responsible AI versus Chat GPT. I personally don't use any AI. Maybe I'm old now and don't want to, but I just feel like it's better coming, directly from me or a source that is reliable. So I understand that. I think with open resources, they're great in certain areas. I would say like nursing, medical, probably not something I would ever suggest just because that is a constantly changing and evolving thing and very technical. But I think that this has been a great discussion, something that I learned new stuff that I didn't know. I will say I feel very lucky because Pearson put a lot of money into their AI that's just in the study tools and it's just included to Pearson. It won't pull from the internet. So I think those type of AIs, I would like. Heather, I know you said there were studies on just AI in general, but there are also. I would love to hear the environmental studies on that because we have to leave the earth better than we found it. And so that would be great, but I do think there is a difference between being responsible with it and Chat GPT. If you understand what I'm saying. But I would love to hear everybody else's feedback because I'm learning so much and I really appreciate it.
Candace, thank you. So I think that's maybe a restatement of some of Kevin's
Right.
points about ethical use. And so I want to turn it back to the panelists to see if anyone wants to respond.
I was just going to thank her for the difference between, yes, when we're usually talking about generative AI and LLMs and not like other specialist AIs that do like one or two things. Like we've had for many years, like the AI that does medical diagnosis for breast cancer, and it works really well, and it's been trained on that. And in my undergrad, I did create a neural network that was relatively large at the time, and the whole servers of all the computer science labs went down because of it. It was a tiny AI still. So I sort of understand like scaling that up. But yeah, there are smaller kinds of artificial intelligence that are used in very specific ways that do one thing very, very well. Those are very different
Right.
talking about.
Right. No, I give you all the credit because I could never do that technology as far as that is concerned, building that. So you're a hero to me. But yeah, I think you're right. I just wanted to see if there was a difference in the panel on how it's used and it was talked about a little bit versus what's responsible, what's not responsible.
So let's get to Ryan, who has patiently had their hand up, and then Kurt, I also see your hand.
All right, yeah, thank you. First, thank you so much for doing this. This has been so interesting. I feel like this could be 2 hours long, and I would hang around for it. Unfortunately, I do have to jump off of here a little early, so I won't be here the whole time. But what I wanted to bring up, actually, Kevin already kind of posted something about this in the chat, and the situation I'm in is that, students are using it. Campus is like really interested in getting it into the classrooms where I work. And so it's kind of like we have to try to keep up. We do one-shot instruction, we do consultations with students. If they're using it, we're going to need to know how to use these tools. I'm very sensitive to the environmental concern. And I think like as librarians, what we're probably going to need to be doing is looking especially at that critical AI information literacy aspect of it and showing them the limitations and stuff like that. But even that, it's still going to necessitate use of the tools. And I just don't see a way around that unless you're using it locally on your computer. And again, just training the LLMs, that takes up a lot of resources, a lot more than just using them. So I don't know if there's really a question in all of that. I just wanted to share that as one of the reasons that I think many of us probably are experimenting with even for like trivial reasons. Just so that we are familiar with the tools. There's so many and they're constantly changing.
Yeah, the way our instruction librarians here at Western Oregon University handle that is to approach it like you would any other thing that faculty may or may not want students to use. So like Wikipedia, right? Personally, I love Wikipedia. And I think there's that perception that, ooh, never use Wikipedia. It's evil. Or, you can't tell where the information is coming from, but there's absolutely ways to use Wikipedia in an informed way. And it's about in telling people, like telling students, this is how it works. This is where it gets its data from. These are problems to look out for. I was trying to find a page our instruction librarians put together um, talking about AI because it's definitely not like the abstinence only approach. I agree. You have to talk about it because if you don't talk about it, people are just going to make up their own minds. And as I've already said, I think they're going to make up their minds based on what companies with large marketing budgets are going to tell them. So with like AI tools, it's not about just saying, "Oh, never use these things." It's about saying, if you use these things, or even when you use these things, if you're probably being realistic these days, make sure you pay attention to X, Y, and Z, because this is how they work. These are some of the problems people have pointed out with them. These are some things you might not realize about it. And then, if faculty want to have their students use it, or students still want to use it, at least they know, right?
That's generally what I'm going for with the policy I have. Um and to be honest, I feel like with the push by I don't think it's like outing our institution or anything, because every institution I know is doing this right now, is like really pushing AI initiatives. So I don't think it would be responded to well if I had a you can't use AI in your OER policy. I don't think that would go well for me or my authors. And the same as a lot of the conversation in the chat is saying, my goal is not necessarily to say never ever do this. My goal is to make sure people know, maybe prompt them to think about some of the issues. That's the goal behind the transparency thing, but also like my responsibility as the publisher of these is to make sure they're legal and to make sure they're, it's not about the actual content of the materials, that's up to the authors, but like, I don't think most people are, or most authors are going to be aware that like, if you have ChatGPT write your chapter, you don't own that. That doesn't qualify for copyright in the same way. So it's more about like, we're in the environment we're in. How do we mitigate? How do we provide the necessary information? How do we mitigate the harm as much as possible, knowing that we can't stop it?
We've got some people in the chat saying they wish they could stay for 2 hours, and I do too. And I want to also just bring our awareness that we're coming around the bend on the hour. So, Kurt, do you want to chime in? And there's just some awesome conversation going on in the chat. So I think Kurt, and then maybe I'll try to give a little bit of a roundup of what's happening.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Kurt Newton, director of MIT OpenCourseWare. I'm just deeply appreciative of the conversations that are happening here and what's been created in this space. So first of all, I'll pause for that. I just wanted to share what's coming up for me and listening to all this. It feels like so much of this is a symptom of deeper and deeper and deeper challenges that we continue to face. The challenge of just constantly being pushed to do more with less, to do it faster with less. And I know that there's a long running conversation about, ways to deal with open is not free and so forth. But it just feels like this is the latest in a long running conversation about how to sort of be conscious and aware. And when we don't have time to take the more environmentally conscious, public transportation that takes an hour and a half to get there. Yeah, I know I got to drive. I'm sorry. We can learn to do that with these tools in the same way. Just recognizing that this is a pattern and this is the latest incarnation of this pattern. My heart breaks for it. It's just recognizing, feels like that's where we are.
So I guess a couple of comments from the chat that I wanted to pull forward. Anastasia says, in a really clarifying way, thank you for saying this. I'm not sure I've heard anyone advocating not to use Gen AI or to evangelize students to shun it, merely to be aware and critical, which this is the purpose of this discussion. Understandably, that can be an uncomfortable and troubling practice for oneself and also to steward and guide for students. And it feels like no choice is good. But that is true of many other aspects of our entire participation in higher ed too. So thank you so much for that. I am resonating a lot with that. And Lauren also says a common thread in what all the panelists brought up is that it seems like we can make a decision between turning our attention away from looking at all of these things as systems, whether they be the profit-driven AI companies, our own libraries and institutions, publishers, US legal system, copyright, and pretending that these systems and all of their biases and motives don't exist, that AI is just something that we have to or should accept, or actually using our time and efforts as OER practitioners to draw attention to these as systems and help our communities understand their motivations, how they can do harm, and their options for opting out of participation. And there's so much more from the chat that I am not able to capture by turning on my mic. But we've got 9 more minutes, and so I want to just turn it back to the panelists. Having had this discussion, do you want to leave us with any final thoughts?
I like those very eloquent sort of summaries. And I'm just going to say one thing and hand over to Heather because I just saw her hand up now. I was going to say, yes, I mean, the reason we did this is to talk about, is there a place for AI in OER? And we're thinking, given the values that we believe most of us in the open movement are towards social justice, a lot of these don't fit the values. We cannot ignore that students have access to AI. So as educators, you really need to understand how it works because your students have access to them. They may not all have the same values of resisting them. So you do need to understand how they work. But I don't play with AI. I will only use it to do research and to research its own ability to do things, not to do research about other things. So I've limited my use of AI because of all these ethical considerations. Go ahead, Heather.
I was just going to say that there's been a lot of conversations in higher ed about what do we do if we don't want students using this, and how do we prevent students from using this and stuff. But I'm actually hearing more of instructors saying this is part of the assignment and students not wanting to use it. And if there are ethical issues, I think that we need to be making room for students to say, there's got to be some other way I can do this. I don't believe that I should be using AI for this. And so that we can have those conversations. It can't just be that the instructor says, no, you can't, or yes, you must. I think there has to be some conversations around that.
I think, Heather, I would agree. Students have, and it varies from school to school and demographic. There are some students that embrace it and some students that are like, no, I don't want to use it. And I think that's a good point to bring up. Thank you.
Stephen and Stewart.
I don't have anything sensible to add. Thank you all for listening.
I'll just say that I appreciated what Kurt said, and what I try to keep reminding myself is like, this isn't new, like the specific technology and what we're talking about is new, but like it, in many ways, it just feels like the latest in a series. Like there's always going to be something. There's always like the new shiny thing that our institution is very excited about, and we need to figure out how to integrate into our work, often because we feel like we are pushed to and not because we actually think it makes sense to integrate into our work. And so for me, sometimes it helps to view all of this as like, this is part of that pattern and we know what to do with that pattern.
Thank you so much. And Stewart, I know that you weren't doing concluding remarks, but I see you being active in the chat. And I'm definitely going to download the chat because I know I haven't kept up with all the amazing things that people have been saying. So can you hear me on my screen? Okay.
Just a little bit.
Okay, I think I've been pretty lucky with my computer holding up during this hour of great conversation. And thank you so, so much to our panelists for really, in my opinion, going against the grain. We're hearing a lot about how AI has already arrived and you're behind if you're not already using it. And I disagree. I think there's room for a lot of different perspectives on it. And I appreciate everyone also for showing up and participating in this great discussion. So let's have a big hand for our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
This is late, but here's my costume. So there you are.
Thank you.
I was eating breakfast earlier.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, bye.
I love it.